Shalom and good evening. I'm pleased to share with you the story of Amenia's Jewish immigrant families in the early 20th century. An outstanding chapter in the history of Amenia, New York began with the arrival of several Jewish families around 1920. These young families had settled first in nearby Connecticut several years earlier, but their move to the town of Amenia provided them with new opportunities for education, business, and agriculture. Amenia also had the advantage of being located on the New York Central Railroad, which aided their endeavors. The arrival of these newcomers brought major changes to the face of the village and added a liveliness in commerce and social activity not seen in decades. Most of these Jewish families arrived in New York City from Russia in the early 1900s. They found work in the sweatshops of the overcrowded Lower East Side. Within a few years, however, they looked for a way to leave the city, to own their own property, and to live in a healthier environment. This dream seemed unattainable, but an amazing opportunity arose, one which provided assistance for them to purchase farmland in rural Connecticut. They took advantage of the offer and actually became farmers. Then, after years of trying to eke out a living on a rocky hilltop without the benefits of electricity or indoor plumbing, they once again looked for new opportunities. These growing families faced new concerns, such as the secondary education of their children. This issue alone influenced their decision to move to Amenia. While some chose to continue farming, others established family businesses, such as owning and operating weekend and summer resorts, or grocery stores or clothing stores. Similar to other immigrant groups, their story, albeit in the unlikely small town of Amenia, is the story of America, of immigrants pursuing opportunities in the land of opportunity. Some of you may ask, why did these Jews leave Russia and come to America in the first place? Well, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March of 1881, violent anti-Jewish riots called pogroms threatened the lives of thousands of Jews living in Western and Southern Russia, within the Pale, as it was called. Perhaps the musical drama Fiddler on the Roof was the way in which many of us learned about this moment in history. Actually, thousands of Jews were killed and many more wounded. These attacks of genocide continued for several decades and caused a great immigration of the people, refugees seeking a new homeland. In response to this terrible situation, a wealthy European railroad financier, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, established a philanthropic foundation that would facilitate Jewish immigration to the Americas. He gave over $2 million to establish the fund. That would be probably well over 60 million today. Mr. Hirsch died in 1896, but the trustees of the Hirsch Fund decided to contribute financial assistance to a kindred organization, the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society, JAIAS, located in Lower Manhattan. JAIAS was formed in order to help Jewish immigrants purchase farmland should they desire to try agriculture as a profession. Whereas in Russia, Jews were not allowed to own farmland, this offer in America was truly a remarkable opportunity. When the Jewish Agricultural Society was founded in 1900, there were only about 200 Jewish farm families in the United States. But by 1933, there were over 100,000 Jewish farmers throughout the country, according to the Jewish Daily Bulletin. JAIAS published a monthly newspaper written in Hebrew and English called The Jewish Farmer, which served to educate, inspire, and provide a network for the farmers. It encouraged modern agricultural techniques and conducted agricultural conferences and fairs, and served as what we might consider a cooperative extension program for those Jewish families engaged in farming. There were Jewish farming communities in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. In fact, the first such colony was in New Jersey. In addition to the Ellsworth community in Connecticut, Sharon, Connecticut, that we'll be referring to, there were Jewish groups in Ellenville and other places in the Catskills to the west, and Sandusfield, Massachusetts, not far from Great Barrington. These and other Jewish farming colonies have been documented in local histories, in newspaper articles, and in books written by descendants and or interested researchers. A book about the Ellsworth Jewish families, A Chance for Land and Fresh Air, was compiled by Carol Asher in 2017. And another book, Soil and Shul in the Berkshires, The Untold Story of Sandusfield's Jewish Farm Colony, was written by Lorraine J. German and published in 2018. Before I introduce you to our Amenia Jewish families, let's take a look at this map. The village of Sharon is close to the New York-Connecticut border, which is in the middle there. And while the hamlet of Ellsworth is on the eastern side of town, closer to Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut. And you can see Amenia to the west. The distance from Ellsworth to Amenia is approximately 11 miles. Our first family that we'll discuss is the Osofsky family. Nathan Osofsky.
We need to mute, if everyone could just mute their microphone so we don't have background. Thank you. So Betsy, I'll let you start again.
Okay, we'll start with the Osofsky family. Nathan Osofsky and his wife, Rebecca, as well as their two little daughters, Frida and Anna, came from the town of Slutsk in Belarus in the early 1900s. Slutsk is about 65 miles south of Minsk, which you can see there on the map, the capital of Belarus. And Belarus was part of the Russian Empire at that time. Nathan came ahead of his family and worked in the garment district of New York City along with his brother Max. There they suffered respiratory ailments due to the unhealthy air. A few years later, with the help of JAIAS, Nathan and Max Osofsky decided to buy farms and settle with their families in Ellsworth. It wasn't long before Nathan and Rebecca had a family of 8 children, 4 girls and 4 boys. While Nathan and his brother Max worked together on the farm, Nathan continued to work part-time in the city. Rebecca supplemented the farm income by taking in Jewish immigrants from the city as boarders during the summer. The Osofskys valued education for their children and appreciated having a one-room schoolhouse in their neighborhood. However, when it came time for Frida, the eldest child, to start high school, their options were fraught with difficulties. The high school in Sharon was too far to walk to every day. And sadly, they did not know anyone in the village of Sharon who would take in a Jewish girl as a boarder. Other arrangements had to be made. The Osofsky family history has recorded that Frida boarded with a Black family in Amenia for at least a year, or until her parents decided to leave Ellsworth and move to Amenia. Each Sunday, by horse and buggy, Nathan would drive his daughter Frida to Amenia, and then on Friday, he would pick her up and bring her home for the weekend before the beginning of Sabbath. This is a photo of the school in Amenia where Frida attended high school. One might wonder how an immigrant Jewish family living in the town of Sharon, Connecticut, were able to arrange for their daughter to board with a Black family in Amenia. The name of the family was a mystery until I started looking into it more closely. A possible connection became evident after studying census data, maps, and newspaper articles about persons of color in both towns. In all probability, the Osofskys' Black neighbors in Ellsworth, the Burgesses, may have suggested that Frida board with their relatives in Amenia, Homer and Ada Carl. Ada Carl, formerly Ada Frazier, had grown up on a farm in Ellsworth. Ada was a good-hearted person, known by everyone in Amenia. At least in 2 instances, she took in elderly Black folks who had no one to care for them at the end of their lives. After the untimely death of her married daughter, Blanche, Ada raised her granddaughter, Lillian. Then another tragedy struck when Lillian died at just 12 years old. Ada Carl was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Amenia and was well known for her hard work and her good cooking at church suppers. Another remarkable tribute to the Carl family is that Homer and Ada's niece, Mildred Carl, was chosen valedictorian of her class at Amenia High in 1925. Although my hunch as to where Frida boarded has not been proven, the Carl family is my best guess to date. After moving from Ellsworth to Amenia in 1918, Nathan and Rebecca Osofsky began a family business right in the center of town, a weekend and summer resort, which they named Hotel Grand House. Jewish families eager to get out of the heat of New York City would take the train to Amenia. They could walk from the station to the hotel. The hotel could not be seen from the main street, but was tucked behind what became Dube's department store. The sign at the left side of the picture, it's small there, but it says, "Hotel entrance, turn right, next street." And if you look down the lane, you can see the door to the bar of the hotel. In time, the hotel boasted of a swimming pool, tennis courts, a dance hall, and 7 acres of bridle paths for horseback riding, as well as a fine kosher restaurant, all that was needed for a good getaway. As the years went by, the hotel became a gathering place for Jewish families and organizations in Amenia. Before the synagogue was built, services were often conducted there. Nathan and Rebecca had 8 children over a 20-year span. Frida was born in 1899, and Sydney, the youngest, was born in 1919. The 4 boys in the photo are Phil, David, Abe, and little Sydney. Sydney's nickname was Shucky, and David was called Dubby, even after they were adults. Frida finished high school and became a teacher in a 1-room schoolhouse in the area. She continued her education at New Paltz Normal College and then taught school in Poughkeepsie for a few years before marrying Alfred Dube. For years, Amenia Historical Society has had only this one fuzzy picture of Frida, but just a few weeks ago, thanks to Facebook and the contributions of long-lost cousins, we now have many more photos. I want to thank Kate Osofsky, daughter of Rick and granddaughter of David, for giving me access to this collection. Here we see Frida as a young, studious woman reading or perhaps preparing lessons, and we also see her as a big sister with her youngest siblings, Emma and Sydney. Frida's husband, or the man that became her husband, Alfred Dube, was born in 1898 and came with his parents from Minsk, Belarus, around 1900. Before moving to Amenia, Alfred lived in New Milford, Connecticut, and where he was in the clothing business. Once, when visiting Amenia on business, he met Frida Osofsky, who was working at the hotel. He and Frida married October 18, 1924. For the next 50 years, Alfred and Frida owned Dube's department store on Main Street with the slogan, "We sell most everything." In case you're curious about his cigar, Alfred smoked Blackstone Panatella cigars. The Dubes had 2 daughters, Judith and Edith. These little girls were fortunate to grow up having grandparents and aunts and uncles right next door to the store. Judy and Edie were both outstanding students at Amenia High School. Both graduated from college and pursued their professions as teacher and social worker. Al and Frida Dube were active members of the Grange. They served on the Sherman Charitable Foundation, and they were leaders in the synagogue. Alfred Dube passed away in 1983 and Frida in 1987. When the store closed in 1975, it was indeed a sad day for Amenia. For 50 years, Dube's department store had provided clothing for all occasions, back to school, work, dress, winter gear, plus household items. Well, just about everything. A story has been told by daughter Edie Dube Schwartz about her own experience working in the store from the time she was 6 years old. On Christmas Eve, she recalled, the farmers would come into the store to do their Christmas shopping. They didn't have a clue as to what to buy. Edie would help them make their decisions, and then she would wrap the items in Christmas wrapping paper for them. Everyone was happy. Now we'll return to some of the other members of the Osofsky family. Just like Frida, shown at the left, her three sisters all became school teachers, Ida, Emma, and Anna. They all taught in the one-room schoolhouses of the area. Emma taught at the Bell School and then at Amenia Elementary School for 13 years. She was Emma Simmons at that point. Nathan Osofsky was a learned man. Here we see him reading the Hebrew newspaper while Emma and Rebecca look on. He was a leader in the Beth David Synagogue and often led the services when a rabbi was not available. At just 53 years old, Abba Natan passed away suddenly of a heart attack in 1935. What a grief it must have been for the whole family. Rebecca and her son Sidney continued to manage the hotel and restaurant until the matriarch passed away in 1953. Rebecca Osofsky was a beloved mother and grandmother to many children and grandchildren, as you can see in this 1944 family reunion photo. Today, farming is still an occupation for some of the Osofsky family. Rick and Ronnie, sons of David and Helen Osofsky, own Ronnie Brook Farm Dairy of Pine Plains. This very successful business offers fresh milk in glass bottles, as well as yogurt, butter, and ice cream, all available today in our local food stores. The whole family are involved with the farm enterprise from the time they're old enough to help with chores and learn to tend the store, like Kate's daughter Claire is doing in this photo. Ronnie Osofsky is the man grinning at the right. This photo is from the Osofsky reunion of 2011. I do not have a comprehensive list of the family, but some of the branches of the family that have stayed in the area include Phil's son, Norman, who resides in Boston Corners, and his son, Aaron, and Sidney's widow, Dorothy, who is the last of that generation, and their daughter, Rebecca Osofsky Hayes. Nathan's brother, Max Osofsky, the one at the left in this photo, and his wife, Rebecca, as we know, were in Ellsworth the whole time that Nathan and his wife were there, and they also moved to Amenia in 1918. They lived on Mill Pond Road, right next door to Homer and Ada Carl, the people who had taken in Frida. Max was a cattle dealer. Today, his son, Joel Osofsky, lives in Ankrum-Dale, New York. Several other Russian Jewish families who had bought farms in Ellsworth through JAIAS relocated to Amenia for the same reasons the Osofskys did, for education of the children and for business opportunities. On this map, you can see 6 boarding houses in Amenia, plus 2 restaurants and Beth David Synagogue. Hotel Grand House is pretty much in the center, not far from the intersection of Route 22, 44, and 343. The other resorts include Lakeview House, just to the west of that, and the Pine Tree Summer Resort, which was at the train station, and then the Roxy Hotel, which is up at the Amenia Northeast town line, and 2 more, Maple Lodge and Weebatuck Summer Resort on Leedsville Road on the eastern part of the town. Now we'll talk about the Rothsteins. Philip Rothstein came from Minsk, Belarus in 1903, and he settled in Ellsworth and met and married Jenny Lipsky before moving to Amenia in 1920. They became the proprietors of Lakeview House on the hillside above Route 44, a lovely resort overlooking the mill pond that became Lake Amenia. The Rothstein children worked in the summer boarding house as they were growing up. During 30 years of hostelry, the Rothsteins welcomed hundreds of guests, providing transportation from the train station, comfortable accommodations, recreational activities like tennis and dancing and swimming, and of course, kosher meals. On Friday evenings during the summer, 7 trains brought weekend guests to Amenia from New York City. The streets of the small town became filled with people. Their loud talking at night would sometimes cause the locals to complain. But overall, the bustling crowds boosted the economy and made the village a lively place. Today, one can hardly imagine what that must have been like. In the 1920s, the cost per person at Lakeview House was just $12 per week. In the 1950s, it was still reasonable at $45 per week. Kosher foods were brought by truck twice a week from Poughkeepsie, though most of the food was supplied locally within the Jewish community from their gardens and farms. In a 1922 newspaper want ad, Philip Rothstein requested hens, all kinds of hens, to be brought to him for purchase. These hens, chickens, were greatly appreciated by the cook, I'm sure, as well as by the patrons. At Lakeview House, Mrs. Rothstein was the main cook, and Mr. Rothstein was the greeter of guests. It's said that he had a great sense of humor. Philip and Jenny Rothstein were the parents of 4 children, Max, Florence, Samuel, and Leon. Max became a pharmacist in Millerton, Florence a bookkeeper, Sam a veterinarian who changed his name to Dr. Samuel Ross, and Leon became an accountant. In this Amenia school photo, we see young Leon as an 8th grader in the upper right corner. While Leon was in the Army during World War II, a young woman named Muriel First vacationed with her parents at Lakeview House. Leon's sister, Florence, asked Muriel if she would write to her lonely brother in the service, which she agreed to do. Some months later, the two met, and the rest is history, as the saying goes. They were married in 1945 while he was still in the service. They lived in Chicago for about a year before he was discharged, and they returned to Amenia. Leon Rothstein was an accountant in Amenia for 50 years. He was a member of the Masonic Lodge, the Democratic Club, the Lions Club. He was instrumental in starting a local unit of the Jewish War Veterans Association in 1948, and he was the treasurer of the synagogue for 35 years. Leon and Muriel had 3 children. Their son, Dr. Richard Rothstein, is the chief of gastroenterology at Dartmouth Medical Center in New Hampshire. He's the one in blue in the middle picture. And a second son, Jay Rothstein, is an investments manager with Fidelity Investments in Massachusetts. He's at the right. And the gal in the middle is their daughter, Gail Rothstein Gamble, who still resides in Amenia, having taught school in the Weebatuck School District for 25 years. She and her husband, Alan Gamble, have 2 adult children and 1 grandson. I want to thank Gail for all her help and support in this endeavor. Another Rothstein brother, Harry Rothstein, made the move, as others did, from Ellsworth to Amenia around 1922. Harry and his wife, Sarah Epstein, with their 4 children, owned the Weebatuck Summer Resort, located at what was formerly an old mill on Leedsville Road. Situated on the Weebatuck Creek, this summer resort provided a cool, shady place for hot city dwellers. It also provided a lovely venue for a wedding. In fact, a double wedding took place on March 31st, 1929, when 2 sisters, Anna and Ida Osofsky, were wed to their respective beaux, Spencer Gray and Albert Epstein. Giving the Osofsky parents a break from the hotel, the Rothsteins provided the perfect place for wedding festivities. Rabbi Khan of Poughkeepsie officiated, and a band played the wedding march. Friends and family from New York and Connecticut attended the celebration and enjoyed a lavish banquet with lively dancing in the spacious dance hall. On behalf of the Beth David Synagogue congregation, Mr. Alfred Dube gave the congratulatory speech for the newlyweds. Harry and Sarah Rothstein had several children, some of whom died young. Of those who lived out their years, Fanny married Frank Luban, Florence married Dr. Charles Roseman of New York City, and Jack married Celeste Portman. Jack and Celeste lived in Amenia and owned the Progressive Pharmacy on Main Street, which had previously been the Rosensons brothers drugstore. Jack was an Amenia pharmacist from 1931 until his retirement in 1972. He hoped to travel in his retirement, but he was often seen in the pharmacy helping the new owner. A third brother, Samuel or Simcha Rothstein, settled in Amenia about the same time as Harry. In 1927, Samuel and his wife Lena and 3 children established a summer boarding house known as Maple Lodge on Leesville Road, just north of his brother Harry's place. At that time, the price per person was $17 a week to stay at the boarding house. In the 1940s, it was just $35 a week. Over the years, many prominent businessmen and their families from New York City were frequent guests at Maple Lodge. While in high school, the children excelled in academics and participated in sports and drama. As the family business grew, the children did their part. 2, daughter Edith became the manager. Daughter Faye was in charge of hospitality. Son Ben drove the guests to and from the train station. And when they married, Ben's wife Ray took over the bookkeeping. In this picture, Ben is the tall young man, third from the right in the back, and his sister is Edith sitting in front of him. There is a Florence Rothstein in the picture, second from the left, sitting down, but she is the daughter of Philip, the first brother we talked about. So Sam and Lena Rothstein moved to Mount Vernon, New York in 1952, at which time Ben and Ray took over the management of the resort for several more years. Then when it closed, they became residents of Wappingers Falls for the rest of their lives. During the Great Depression, oops, I guess now it's circling the people,
okay.
but that's okay. You'll see them up close. There we go. I didn't know it was going to do that either. During the Great Depression, Sam Rothstein collected scrap metal and junk with his horse and wagon. On one occasion, according to a newspaper article of 1936, the contents of the wagon were stolen when his horse ran away and he had to leave the wagon unattended to go find the horse. Another hardship that year was when Lena was hospitalized in Sharon Hospital for 2 months after being hit by a car. Fortunately, the children were able to help their father keep things going at home. The Goldmans. Harry Goldman and his wife Fanny came from Russia to Ellsworth in 1904. The Goldmans moved to Amenia before 1920 and became the proprietors of the Pine Tree Summer Resort, a lovely residence located near the present-day rail trail. The railroad station was right across the tracks. In 1928, they added a 16-room boarding house to the property, which allowed them to accommodate many more guests. I believe that's the red building at the top of the driveway in the picture. Being located next to the train station must have made for a less than tranquil surroundings, but it also brought in the business. The Goldman sons, Hyman and Irving Goldman, both became pharmacists and purchased what was the Baker's Drugstore or Amenia Pharmacy, located at the Four Corners in 1940. The Goldmans were founding members of the Beth David Synagogue. The Lubanskis. Isidore Lubansky and his wife Anna came from Slutsk, Belarus, to Ellsworth and then to Amenia before 1925, along with their 3 children and 2 Epstein nephews by that time. Isidore was a kosher butcher and established Lubanski's Market, a kosher meat market and grocery. In the picture, the Lubansky word is in the on the building to the far left. It says Lubanski's Market. It was on Main Street. This business continued into the 1960s under the ownership of his nephew, Dan Epstein. Isidore and Anna Lubansky were active in founding Beth David Synagogue, and their names decorate one of the stained glass windows. The Lubanskis' son Joseph, who changed his name to Joseph Lawrence, became a doctor of dentistry and lived in New York City. Their daughter Lillian married a businessman, Phil Strauss, and remained in Amenia until 1966. Daniel and Joseph Epstein were raised by the Lubanskis after the death of their father. Maybe if you press it again, some circles will come. Ah, there they go. Raphael Epstein was their father, Mrs. Lubansky's brother. While growing up in Amenia, young Daniel worked in Lubansky's Market. In time, it became known as Dan's Market. And after 25 years of working in Amenia, Dan closed the store in 1964. A few years later, he bought the Dairy Queen in Millerton. Though unthinkable at the time, Dan Epstein married a Catholic girl, Marion Thompson of Amenia. Her family owned the gas station at the Four Corners. Without a doubt, neither family approved of the marriage. In fact, Dan's uncle, Mr. Lubansky, disowned him for marrying outside the faith. I think this was in the 1930s. Here we see Dan Epstein in his market and his son, Barney. We'll talk about Barney. Dan's son, Barney Epstein, was raised in Amenia and still keeps in touch with his Amenia friends. While a student at Weebatuck High, Barney excelled in drama and was known for his participation in the school stage productions. He went on to study theater at Manhattan College and at Yale School of Drama, and to develop a very successful career in theater in New York City as stage manager in several prestigious theaters. Joseph Epstein, the brother of Daniel, went into business college and tried his hand at a variety of businesses. In 1939, he and Phil Strauss, his brother-in-law, bought the Brookside restaurant on Route 343 in Amenia. It became a popular restaurant under their management. Actually, it wouldn't have been his brother-in-law, it would have been a cousin-in-law. Joseph later married and moved to Florida. I'm getting rattled. Okay, about Phil Strauss. Philip Strauss was formerly Philip Schmuckler, living in New York City in 1934, when he happened to meet Dan Epstein. Not long thereafter, Phil arrived in Amenia and met Dan's cousin, Lillian Lubansky, whom he married in 1935. Phil and Lil were a dynamic duo, enthusiastically involved in Amenia commerce. Together, they owned and operated the Brookside restaurant, a popular dining and banquet venue. At one time, Phil owned the Amenia and the Pine Plains movie theaters. He also owned the Harlem Valley Times newspaper from 1951 to 59 and was regarded as Amenia's acclaimed freelance photographer during that time. As editor of the paper, he had a column called Philosophies, in which he shared his observations and witticisms. Phil and Lil sold the Brookside restaurant in 1966 and moved to Florida. The Epsteins. The name Epstein is connected with several of the Ellsworth to Amenia families, as you may have noticed. Another Epstein sibling, Louis Epstein, owned the Sharon Station Hotel, later known as the Roxy, from 1931 to 1945. This handsome boarding house was located across the road from Sharon Station. Sharon Station is not in Connecticut, as you might think, but it is north of the Amenia Station on the Amenia Northeast Line. The hotel was a Jewish resort which boasted of having a dance hall for weekend fun and a place to swim at nearby Round Pond. The Kaplans. Louis and Lena Kaplan and their 3 children moved to Amenia before 1920 and were founding members of the synagogue as well. Louis and Lena invested in real estate in Amenia, which they remodeled as rental properties. One of their first enterprises was a gas station on Route 343, built in 1930, to which they added a tea room. And a few years later, they enlarged it by adding a banquet hall and a dance floor. This attractive spot became the previously mentioned Brookside Restaurant. The Kaplans managed that concern until 1939, when they sold it to Joe and Phil. In 1941, Louis and Lena built a restaurant on Delaverne Hill, the hill to the west of Amenia, called the Tollgate Inn, which they managed for a few years and sold in 1945. The building is still standing and is called the Amenia Steakhouse. The Kaplans spent summers in Amenia and winters in Florida until 1956, when they permanently moved to Florida. The Paleys. Max Paley and his wife, Sarah Ida, came from Russia around 1900. Max worked in New Haven, Connecticut, as a garment maker until 1918, when he and his family moved to Ellsworth. There, they assumed the ownership of Nathan and Rebecca Osofsky's boarding house. A decade later, the Paleys were living in Amenia, having sold the boarding house to their daughter, Bertha, and her husband, Louis Gorkovsky. Morris Paley, in the photo here, was Max Paley's grandson. Max died in 1937, leaving his son Hyman on the family farm in Amenia on Old Route 22. A year later, Hyman and his family moved to a farm in Sharon. But just 6 years after that, Hyman passed away at age 46, leaving Morris in charge of the farm in Sharon. Another unthinkable union took place in the community. Morris eloped with the girl next door, Emma Carberry. Emma was from a Catholic family that frowned upon the marriage. However, Morris and Emma remained devoted to each other for 60 years and produced a family of 8 children. Morris passed away in 2014. Here in this photo, widow Emma is with her son Charlie Paley, 2016, at the Synagogue Social Hall. Charlie operated the Paley's Farm Market on Route 343, located near the Sharon town line, Sharon-Amenia line, for many years. Today, his sister Sarah and her husband, Chris Kuhn, are in charge of the market. We're getting there. The Rosensons. Harry and Bessie Rosenson, another Epstein, Bessie Epstein Rosenson, came from Russia and lived for a time in Ellsworth. Harry was a cattle dealer, as were many of the Jewish immigrants. Before 1925, the Rosensons moved to Amenia with their 4 children and Harry's mother. Their generosity provided the land on which the synagogue was built. In the same year, 1929, their sons Joseph and Henry Rosenson purchased the Hills Drugstore on Main Street and named it the Rosenson Brothers Drugstore. They remodeled it by adding a popular soda fountain and then flipped it. Sold it to Jack Rothstein in 1931. I've told you about him already. And he named it Jack's Progressive Pharmacy. Harry Rosenson, the brother of Jacob, and his wife also moved from Ellsworth to Amenia with their children, and they were founding members of the synagogue, and he was also a cattle dealer. Harry and Rebecca Weinstein moved to Ellsworth around 1920, where they shared the farm that had been the Osofsky's place with Louis and Bertha Gorkovsky. Harry and Louis were cattle dealers. Though active members of the synagogue, the Weinsteins did not move to Amenia until 1950. Their son, Richard Weinstein, was a pharmacist in Millerton for many years. Okay, we're going to mention a few more families, if you can bear with, to try to give you a broad picture of all the Jewish merchants and people within the town of Amenia, who there were some who came 20 to 30 years before the influx of people from Ellsworth. And it gives us a broader picture of the Jewish community, and it also gives us a hint of why these Russian families were welcomed to Amenia. Also, by reviewing the Jewish families and their comings and goings, it becomes apparent that a vacancy created by The departure of one family provided an opportunity for another family to move into that property, kind of like the game musical chairs. Perhaps the earliest Jewish merchant to start a business in Amenia was Morris Goldman, not to be confused with the Goldmans who had the boarding house 30 years later. This Morris Goldman established a dry goods store on Main Street in 1890. The Goldman children were probably the first Jewish children to attend Amenia High School. Morris's son Abraham was well-liked and was the assistant manager of the Amenia Monarchs baseball team. This picture is around 1908. The Goldmans sold their business in 1910 to Samuel Lapin and moved to New York City. Samuel and Sarah Lapin came from Waterbury, Connecticut to Amenia in 1910, just 8 years before the Jewish families from Ellsworth arrived. Their 6 children attended Amenia High School and were probably the only Jewish children living in town at that time. In 1925, Solomon Rosen owned the corner store, a clothing store on the corner of Mechanic and Main Street in Amenia. The store advertised as the Square Deal Store or the Reliable Department Store. Sam was a founding member of the Synagogue, and in 1931, he sold his business to Morris Cohen, and he bought an Army-Navy surplus store in Poughkeepsie. Morris and Anna Cohen first visited Amenia in 1920 as guests at the Rothsteins' Lakeview house. They soon decided to move to Amenia, and eventually they purchased Sam Rosen's store. Within a few years, they relocated it to the Four Corners. It's the white store that says sale in the window there. He was a vital member. Morris was a vital member of the community and served in the synagogue and in the fire department until his passing in 1965. The Acklemanns. Irving and Esther Acklemann arrived in Amenia in 1930. They came from New Jersey. They established the Acklemann tailoring and cleaning business on Mechanic Street, which their son Herbert later took over. Herb Acklemann served in the U.S. Air Corps in World War II. The Logans and the Kahns, opening a confectionery shop on Main Street in 1917, Morris and Dora Logan expanded the business eventually to sell radios, Victrolas, and women's clothing. Mr. Logan died in 1937, leaving Dora to make a living renting rooms and sewing. They had no children. They were charter members of the Beth David Synagogue. Jacob and Sarah Kahn arrived around 1930 and took over the confectionery shop in Morris Logan's building. Later, they changed it to the United Cigar Agency and sold tobacco and newspapers and candy. Their son, Wallace Kahn, was a dentist in Amenia until the mid-1970s. Almost all the Jewish families I've mentioned thus far were members of Beth David congregation over the following decades. 2 other synagogue families that were more closely related or associated with Millerton than with Amenia and yet played an important role in the temple are worthy of mention. Millerton storekeeper Irving Saperstein served as president of the Beth David congregation for many years. He and his wife Shirley and their children were active in the life of the synagogue, quietly demonstrating his generosity behind the scenes. Irving was a gentle force for good in Millerton. His son, Louis Saperstein, who took over the family business, is also kind-hearted and humble like his father. In 2017, the Saperstein store closed after 71 years of service in the community. Another Millerton mensch, Jacob Scheuffet, son of Rabbi Barnett Scheuffet, spent his early years in Ellsworth in a house without plumbing or electricity. When he was 9, the family moved into the village of Sharon. Though they were not well received by the townspeople, the Scheuffets refused to move. Jake graduated from the Sharon High School and then joined the Army Air Corps during World War II. He was a wing gunner on B-24 bombers and received medals of distinction for his action in the Pacific. While stationed in North Dakota, He had the good fortune to meet Irving Saperstein. Jake encouraged Irv to move to Millerton and start his clothing store there, which he did. Jake was a man of many accomplishments. Soon after the war, he worked at Hotel Grand House, helping Frida Osofsky and his mother keep the place open. In 1953, Jake built the Gateway Drive-In restaurant on Route 22, more recently called the Round Two It and now called the Round Three. In 1958, he married his wife, Shirley, who for many years was the office nurse for an Amenia doctor. Everyone knew them. In 1959, Jake became the manager of Weebatuck School Cafeteria. And some years later, he was the beloved mayor of Millerton and served for 3 terms. Now I'd like to talk about the synagogue itself. As soon as there were enough Jewish men in Amenia to form a minyan, that is a group of at least 10 men to assemble for prayer services, a congregation was established. They met first in homes or at the Osofsky's hotel. A growing community needed a synagogue. Undoubtedly, amongst their large families, there were children of the age for bar and bat mitzvahs, and these observant families, religious education was just as important as public school education. When the cornerstone was laid on May 12, 1929, there were 13 founding families. The notable event was organized by Mr. Dube, who invited community leaders to be honorary speakers. Amenia Town Supervisor Joseph McEnroe gave a speech. Reverend Steele of the Amenia Presbyterian Church and Rabbi Schwartz of Vassar Temple in Poughkeepsie and others participated. Several hundred people from Amenia and the vicinity attended, making it a joyous occasion. An impressive brick edifice was constructed quickly during the summer months, allowing Beth David congregation to celebrate its official opening in September of that year. Over the ensuing decades, the synagogue was the center of Jewish community worship and celebration. The children attended Hebrew school, or Sunday school as it was called. The ladies formed a local chapter of the Hebrew Aid Society in 1939. And a sisterhood of the temple was formed the following year, drawing in women from neighboring towns for social activities and fundraising events such as dances and rummage sales to raise funds for an emergency relief fund. The Bessie Rosensons Center, built in 1949, provided a place for youth groups and other groups to meet for activities like pizza parties and dancing. Of course, observing the high holy days during the year and celebrating bar and bat mitzvahs and weddings were paramount in the life of the Beth David congregation. In conclusion, Amenia's era of Jewish resorts gradually came to an end following World War II. This happened for a couple of reasons. In many families, the younger generation went off to college and acquired professions that led them to other places. At the same time, larger, more attractive Jewish resorts were developed in the Catskills, enticing families to go there for vacation. Sadly, as the Amenia boarding houses closed, other businesses in town disappeared as well. Dube's department store was the last to close in 1975. And consequently, with fewer Jewish families in town, the synagogue too became less active in the community. The times, they were a-changing. Finally, it is with gratitude that we document this chapter of Amenia's history. We recognize and appreciate the Jewish families who blessed Amenia with their talents and with their enthusiasm for all aspects of community life. L'chaim, to life, l'chaim.